A French man with big ideas, a brand new invention, and ambition so grand it led to one of the most mysterious cases of a missing person. Who knew the invention of motion pictures had such a weird beginning? This is Talk Hollywood to me. Hi, I'm Sierra, and welcome to Talk Hollywood to me, where I talk Hollywood to you. This is our first episode, and I'm starting it with one of the two things that I am most passionate about when it comes to film. If you know me personally, you know both and no, I will not be talking about Peter O'Toole and his 8 Oscar nominations and no wins. Ask me about it, and I won't be able to stop talking and complaining, so it's best if you don't do that. So today, I will be kicking off this podcast with the beginning of film as we know it back in the 1800s. Film is still relatively new, with the oldest surviving film dating back to 1888 in France. This predates the works of the Lumiere brothers, Georges Méliès, and Thomas Edison, an important name in this story. Again, if you know me, you know how much I detest Edison, and this is one of the reasons why. He might have orchestrated a man's murder. Let's get started. Louis Le Prince was born Louis-Aimé Augustin Le Prince in Metz, France on August 28th in 1841. There's not much important in his early life or much noted aside from how his father was in the French army. His father's friend was the inventor of the first photographic process, the daguerreotype, Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre. From him he learned about photography and chemistry, and Le Prince went on to study art. Le Prince was described by his colleague Frederick Masson as such. In conclusion, I would say that Mr. Le Prince was, in many ways, a very extraordinary man, apart from his inventive genius, which was undoubtedly great. He stood 6 foot 3 inches or 4 inches, 190 centimeters, in his stockings, well built in proportion, and he was most gentle and considered and, though an inventor, of extremely placid disposition which nothing appeared to ruffle. Can then be assumed that no one, for personal reasons, would want this man dead and or gone. Louis Le Prince was a nice and good man and wouldn't wrong anyone. So what about him could make someone want him to disappear? Maybe he wronged someone in his youth. Maybe Louis Le Prince had some unknown enemies across the ocean. Maybe someone wanted his inventions, and to get that, he needed to be dead. The 3 biggest names in film history books are Thomas Edison, the Lumiere brothers, and Georges Méliès. Those are the only names mentioned that I've seen in any books I've had or textbooks I've read. I don't quite remember how I first found out about Louis Le Prince, but I've championed his name ever since. If you know of BuzzFeed Unsolved, you've likely heard his name before because Ryan and Shane did an episode on him. My friends told me about it the moment it came out, because for months now I've talked all their ears off about Louis Le Prince and how much Thomas Edison is a hack and a terrible person. But that's a story for a different day, and so is how Nikola Tesla is better. But anyway, let's start with how Louis Le Prince got his start with motion pictures. After living in France for a time, he moved to Leeds, England in 1866 with his friend John Whitley, and 3 years later Le Prince married Whitley's sister, Elizabeth, which I'm sure must have been interesting for John Whitley. In 1881, he made his way over to the United States, and it is here where he applied for a patent for a 16-lens camera and projector. The patent was described as a, quote, method of and apparatus for producing animated pictures of natural scenery and life, end quote. It was designed in 1886 in New York, made in 1887 in France, and Le Prince received the patent at the top of 1888. He submitted a similar one in the United Kingdom, but had later added an addendum about a single-lens camera. He submitted the addendum on October 10, 1888, and just 4 days later is when Le Prince made history. At some point, he had made his way back to England, and it is where the oldest surviving film was made. October 14, 1888, is when Louis Le Prince recorded Roundhay Garden Scene in Roundhay, Leeds. At 2 seconds long, it was filmed in Oakwood Grange and featured Le Prince's son, Adolphe Le Prince, and Louis Le Prince's in-laws, Sarah and Joseph Whitley, and Annie Hartley. This was the first of 3 short films recorded with Le Prince's single-lens camera, with accordion player perhaps being shot the same day as Roundhay Garden Scene. Later in the month, Traffic Crossing Leeds Bridge was recorded, and was presumably and unfortunately the last thing recorded by Le Prince. His single-lens camera received patents in England and France, and Le Prince was well on his way to becoming a pioneer in film and motion pictures, even if he might not have known it at the time. In 1889, he took dual citizenship with the United States and France so he could further his research there. At the time, no one knew who he was, and the prince didn't know what motion pictures would become. Though he screened the 3 shorts for his close family and friends at home, they didn't know what the future of this new technology would become. Louis Le Prince was a rising star. He was shining bright, and in September 1890, he was going to exhibit his films in public for the first time at Morris Trammell Mansion in Manhattan. His wife and family, who had been living in New York City for the past few years, were eagerly awaiting his return. For some, he might have been shining a bit too bright and wanted him to get too close to the sun. It all happened on September 16th, 1890. Louis Le Prince arrived on September 13th in Dijon to visit his brother for 3 days. His brother, on the 16th, saw him off on the train that was bound for Paris. Following his arrival in Paris, he would visit family and friends before going first to England, then to New York City for his first public exhibition. But that never happened. The train arrived in Paris, family and friends waiting to see Louis Le Prince step off with his luggage. They waited and waited, but neither he nor his luggage came off the train. Louis Le Prince would never be seen again. People confirmed seeing Le Prince board the train and settle in, but somewhere between Dijon and Paris, he disappeared. No body or luggage was found by the train tracks between the 2 destinations, and no body or luggage has ever been found. In 1897, he was declared dead in absentia by his family. In 2003, there was a photograph of a drowning victim from 1890 that was found, and the man resembled Le Prince. Could it be him? It's entirely possible. So, what happened to Louis Le Prince? No one knows for certain, and it's unlikely anyone ever will know. All that we're left with are theories, of which there are 4 big ones. The biggest one I will get to last. The first one is suicide. This was claimed by the grandson of Le Prince's brother. He told a film historian that Le Prince was on the verge of bankruptcy and had already made a plan for his body and luggage, which contained all of his paperwork regarding his cameras and all other things related to film, to never be found. The film historian replied that the business Le Prince had was profitable and he wouldn't have been anywhere near bankruptcy. The second theory is a forced disappearance ordered by his family. This one is a bit crazy, in my opinion. In 1966, Jacques Deslandes, and I hope I'm pronouncing that one right, put forth his theory in the comparative history of cinema. He said it was due to financial reasons, what he calls, quote, familial conveniences, end quote. A journalist quotes a note he was given by the director of the Dijon Municipal Library in 1977 that Le Prince had actually died in Chicago in 1898. So why had he moved? Because his family wanted him to, because he was gay. There's no evidence to assert this fact, but I will say that it's unlikely anyone would have been openly gay in that specific time period. The next theory is that it was fratricide, or that his brother killed him specifically for money. Jean Mitry proposed in 1967 in the Histoire du Cinéma that if Le Prince wanted to disappear, he could have done so at any time before that. If Le Prince happened to be suicidal and his brother knew this, why didn't he tell the police before he boarded the train? It all boils down to the idea that Le Prince never got on the train at all, and that his brother killed him for money. This, too, is an unsubstantiated theory. That brings us to the granddaddy of all theories, the one that I personally find perhaps the most plausible and the one that's been written about the most, and that is Equity 6928, or, as it's better known, the Patent Wars assassination. The biggest piece of evidence I will once again present at the end, and it's something that I actually only recently discovered, and by that I mean yesterday, which would be March 18th at the time I record this, and I'm surprised no one has talked about this more. But you'll find out what it is soon enough. Unless you're my friends, in which case I was yelling about it all last night as soon as I discovered it. They are real troopers for listening to me complain about him and talk about this for so long. But moving on. The theory is this. Louis Le Prince was murdered for his work, and the name attached to it is none other than Thomas Alva Edison. You know, the man widely credited for being the father of film. 3 years after Louis Le Prince's disappearance, Thomas Edison debuted his kinetoscope to the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. And 2 years after that, in 1898, was when the American Mutoscope Company got involved. No story would be interesting unless a little lawsuit gets involved. But this is not just a little lawsuit. Thomas Edison made the claim that he was, quote, the original, first, and sole inventor or discoverer of cinematography, end quote, and was something the U.S. Circuit Court for the Southern District of New York had to decide. Mutoscope disagreed with Edison's statement, saying, quote, the apparatus for taking and exhibiting photographs of objects in motion was well and widely known prior to the alleged invention of the said Edison, end quote. The LaPrince family got involved with the lawsuit because Mutoscope themselves asked them to testify on their behalf. At last, the family thought, Louis will get the recognition he deserves. His son, Adolphe LaPrince, was the person that championed his father the most and was prepared to testify and bring his father's name to the forefront. He was ready. But he never got the chance. Adolphe was exploited by lawyers on both sides for their own means. Waiting for him outside were his father's beloved cameras, ones he was eagerly waiting to bring in. But Mutoscope wouldn't let it happen. Louis LaPrince's widow Elizabeth, also known as Lizzie, had written in her memoirs that they were only interested in LaPrince, quote, insofar as my son's testimony set aside the claims of their rivals. Establishing our claim would have meant their paying royalties to us. End quote. Any direct mention of Louis LaPrince's invention could get the LaPrinces off the case as fast as they could possibly be thrown off it. They had to sit back and watch the trial unfold without any modicum of credit going towards their father and husband. I'm sure Adolphe LaPrince was upset due to the fact that he worked with his father on many of his projects, few as they may be. In 1901, the court case ended and they ruled in favor of Thomas Edison. Equity 6928 declared Thomas Edison as the sole inventor of motion pictures and the motion picture camera. Louis LaPrince's star had fallen. Thomas Edison had won and he secured his place in history. This is what the history books talk about. What they don't mention is how 1 year later in 1902, the result was overturned by the Court of Appeals. The court declared, quote, it is obvious that Mr. Edison is not a pioneer in the large sense of the term. He was not the inventor of the film. Undoubtedly, Mr. Edison, by utilizing this film and perfecting the first apparatus for using it, met all the conditions necessary for commercial success. This, however, did not entitle him under the patent laws a monopoly of all camera apparatus capable of utilizing the film. Now, if only that were applied to many of his other inventions, he might not be hailed so greatly as he is today. But again, I will not get off track with complaining about Edison too much. In another unfortunate turn of events for the LaPrince family, Adolphe LaPrince never lived to see this reversal. Instead, he met his own tragic end 2 years after he testified in the suit. He was found shot dead while duck hunting on Fire Island in New York. Discovered with a gun by his side, it was never determined if it was suicide, an accident, or a foul play, with a U, not a W, was involved. And that means murder. For Elizabeth LaPrince, it was an easy choice. She believed it to be murder. Adolphe LaPrince had said something in court that stuck with her and led her to this conclusion. Her son had said in court that he knew too much. What he was referring to isn't known, but whatever it was, it could have potentially led to his own demise. If Edison was involved in that, it hasn't been talked about much. But Edison most definitely had something to do with Louis. Some years back, Alexis Bedford, then a graduate student of chemistry and photography at the University of New York, was leafing through papers on Thomas Edison and his work on old lighting methods in the archives of the New York Library when he happened to find an old, worn, leather-bound book. It was one journal of many that Edison kept where he would jot down ideas and data. Bedford believed he was just going to find some interesting information about Edison's laboratory work, maybe some things that weren't previously known to the public. What he found wasn't previously known, but it wasn't exactly what he was expecting. Perhaps fate had something in store to make Alexis Bedford discover this, as Louis LaPrince also studied chemistry and photography. Upon the discovery of one particular entry, small but nonetheless notable, Bedford needed to know if it was genuine, if it was authentic and actually true. With permission from the library curator Charlene Edmonds, Bedford rushed back to the university, and it was turned over to historian Robert E. Meyer. Weeks passed as Meyer determined the journal's authenticity. He made handwriting comparisons, and a slew of other tests I'm sure are quite difficult. The journal from over a century ago would most definitely have some faded pages in handwriting, and much was to be investigated. Meyer eventually concluded that the journal was genuine and the handwriting lined up. It was most definitely Thomas Edison's. And this means that, on September 20th, 1890, 4 days after Le Prince's disappearance and when he was last seen, Thomas Edison wrote this. Eric called me today from Dijon. It has been done. Prince is no more. This is good news, but I flinched when he told me. Murder is not my thing. I'm an inventor, and my inventions for moving images can now move forward. The peer-reviewed scientific journal this was published and released this article in 2008. In my months of researching and deep diving into this case, I had never found this particular piece. In fact, if you Google Louis Le Prince's name, it is the second result to pop up. For me, at least. Now, I have no idea why Thomas Edison would write that down in his journal, but Thomas Edison did a lot of dumb and crazy things, which you can look up on your own time, but moving on. So what does this all mean? The journal was confirmed to be authentic and was written in Edison's hand. This could potentially point toward the Patmore's assassination theory being true, confirmed by the man himself, buried in some library archives to be lost and dead to the world forever. Louis Le Prince, in the end, got a bit of credit for his work. As early as the 1930s, he was being called the father of cinematography, but Edison still has his name up in the stars and down in the history books as the father of film. Because Le Prince never publicly exhibited anything, he contributed nothing to further influence cinema as a commercial work. But it's not like he could. He disappeared on the eve of his presentation, and Thomas Edison came in and took the reins. His film Chariot would lead him to great success and have his name amongst the likes of Auguste and Louis Lumiere and Georges Méliès. Open any book, any textbook, about the history of film in its very beginnings, and you will find their names. You will never find Louis Le Prince's. Even if his name may not be in the history books, the least I can do is what I'm doing now, telling his story. Well, the least I could do is nothing, but besides that very literal take, telling a story is what I can do for him. And now you, the listener, have this information like I do. Louis Le Prince's name may not be in the textbook now, and it may not ever be in a textbook. That's something entirely possible. It's just like Alice Guy. You don't see her name anywhere despite being possibly the earliest female filmmaker and incredibly prolific. A special shout out to Dr. Palmer in the film department who taught us about her in the world cinema class. Le Prince's name may not be written down in anything widely known, like I said, but now you know his name and what his story is. Maybe someday we'll read his name in a film textbook, and his name will be up there with the rest of the greats, where it rightfully belongs. And with that, the story of Louis Le Prince has been told to the best of my abilities, even if this episode is a bit short. I hope one day he gets the credit and recognition he deserves, albeit centuries later. Thank you all so much for listening to the first episode about Louis Le Prince and doing so willingly. God knows my friends had to and still have to endure me ranting and rambling about Louis Le Prince and Thomas Edison, and they are some real troopers for that. If you like this episode and want to hear more from me, please review this podcast and where you're listening to it, be it iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you may be listening to this. I would greatly appreciate it as I have many more fun and interesting stories to tell. Take the next one, for example. On our next episode of Talk Hollywood to Me, I'll be talking about a family feud, and I don't mean the game show. Having family involved in Hollywood is never easy, especially when you and your sister are competing actresses. Livy can, Joan can't. Oscars on the line. A feud lasting for decades. I will be telling the story of Olivia de Havilland and her sister, Joan Fontaine. This is a story of sibling rivalry more intense than one of you and your sibling trying to see who can come up with a wilder plot point for the story you were creating with your brats and Barbie dolls. In my case, at least. Again, thank you for turning in to episode 1 of Talk Hollywood to Me. To check out more, go to www.uncwtealtv.org/Hawkstream or on iTunes and Spotify. Until next time, I'm Sierra, and this has been Talk Hollywood to Me, where I talk Hollywood to you. Have a fantastic day.